Hi, I'm Sophia. Last Friday night, I walked into my father's retirement celebration at the Riverside Country Club, expecting maybe an awkward family dinner and a few forced smiles. What I found instead was a name tag waiting for me at the registration table that read, Sophia Reeves, the mistake. My own father had labeled me that way in front of his colleagues, friends, and our entire extended family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd heard all year. What they didn't know was that I had the power to erase his entire retirement fund with a single phone call. And by Sunday morning, I did exactly that. But the real loss wasn't his pension. It was the moment he realized that the daughter he'd spent 32 years dismissing had been controlling his financial future all along. The silence in that room when the truth came out was deafening. Keep watching, because what happened next made my entire family realize they never really knew me at all. The October rain had been falling steadily across Portland for 3 days straight, turning the city's famous roses into scattered petals along the sidewalks. I pulled my navy wool coat tighter as I stepped out of the rideshare car, the familiar weight of disappointment already settling in my chest before I'd even walked through the doors. The Riverside Country Club stood like a monument to everything my family valued: tradition, appearances, and the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. I paused for a moment under the covered entrance, watching the warm lights spill through the tall windows. Inside, I could see clusters of people in business attire, champagne glasses catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. This was Richard Reeves' night. 43 years with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing Corp., climbing from a junior accountant to chief financial officer, and now finally ready to collect his pension and fade into the comfortable retirement he'd always planned. My father had worked his entire adult life for this moment, and somehow, despite everything between us, I still wanted to be there to witness it. The registration table was draped in white linen, with neat rows of name tags arranged alphabetically. Helen Carter, my father's longtime colleague from HR, stood behind it with her practiced smile, the kind that had navigated countless corporate events over the decades. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore the same style of pearl earrings she'd worn to every company function I could remember. "Sophia," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're not quite sure how to categorize you. "I wasn't certain you'd make it tonight." I forced a smile. "Wouldn't miss Dad's big night." She fumbled through the name tags, her fingers pausing over several before finally lifting one. "Here we are," she said, and I watched her face for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she found what was printed there as inappropriate as I was about to. The name tag was identical to all the others: white background, elegant black script, the company logo in the corner. But where everyone else's read their name and title, mine read, Sophia Reeves, the mistake. The blood drained from my face so quickly I thought I might faint. Helen's smile didn't waver, didn't even flicker. She handed it to me like it was perfectly normal, like labeling someone's daughter as a mistake at a professional gathering was just another Tuesday evening. "There you go, dear," she said, already turning to greet the next arrival. I stood there, holding the name tag, reading it again and again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they didn't. The mistake. Not even my name and unemployed or student or any of the dozen other ways they could have acknowledged that I didn't fit neatly into their corporate world. Just the mistake. Around me, conversations continued as if nothing had happened. A group of men in navy suits discussed quarterly projections near the bar. Women in cocktail dresses exchanged pleasantries about vacation plans and children's accomplishments. The normal sounds of a retirement party. The kind of event where everyone knew their role and played it perfectly. I pinned the name tag to my coat with hands that barely trembled. I'd learned long ago not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down in public. Instead, I lifted my chin and walked into the main reception hall, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors with a confidence I didn't feel. The room was beautiful, I had to admit. Round tables draped in cream linen filled the space, each one adorned with low arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus. A small stage had been set up at the far end, where my father would presumably give his farewell speech later in the evening. Everything was perfect, elegant, exactly what Richard Reeves deserved for his years of dedicated service. I spotted my family immediately. They'd claimed a table near the front, naturally. My mother, Patricia, wore a midnight blue dress that complemented her silver hair beautifully. She'd always been elegant in that effortless way that came from growing up with money and learning early how to present herself in any situation. Beside her sat my brother Marcus, 34 years old and already a vice president at a tech startup, his wife Lauren glowing beside him in emerald green. My sister Diana had chosen burgundy, her husband Kevin looking uncomfortable in his rarely worn suit. They were laughing about something when I approached, the kind of easy family laughter that had never included me. Diana noticed me first, her eyes immediately dropping to my name tag. I watched her face change, watched the laughter die in her throat before spreading into something that looked uncomfortably like amusement. "Oh my God, Sophia," she said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Your name tag." Marcus turned to look, and his grin was immediate and unapologetic. "Dad's got quite the sense of humor tonight," he said, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast. Truth in advertising, right? The people at the nearby tables began to turn and look. I felt their eyes on me, saw some of them reading my name tag and exchanging glances. A few chuckled quietly behind their hands. One elderly woman, someone I vaguely recognized from previous company events, shook her head with what might have been sympathy or might have been second-hand embarrassment. My mother finally looked up from her conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. Her gaze found my name tag, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something like regret flicker across her features. But then she looked away, picked up her wine glass, and said nothing at all. "Where should I sit?" I asked, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. Diana gestured vaguely toward an empty chair at the far end of their table, the one that would put my back to most of the room. "There's space there, I guess." I remained standing. "Actually, I think I'll mingle first. Say hello to some of Dad's colleagues." What I really wanted was to find my father and ask him to explain, to give him the chance to tell me this was some kind of mistake, that he hadn't personally approved a name tag calling his own daughter an error in judgment. But as I moved through the room, I kept getting distracted by the reactions. People read my name tag and did double takes. Some tried to hide their amusement behind polite smiles. Others weren't even that courteous. I heard whispers following me as I walked. "Did you see what her name tag says? And Richard really put that on there?" And, well, she was always the odd one out, wasn't she? Near the appetizer table, I encountered Thomas Brennan, the company CEO, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded rooms. He'd known me since I was a child, had been to countless family barbecues and holiday parties over the years. "Sophia," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Good to see you here tonight. Your father must be..." His words died as his eyes found my name tag. The warmth in his expression shifted to something more uncomfortable, like he'd walked in on a private family argument he wanted no part of. "Yes," I said simply. "He must be." Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in the shrimp cocktail. "Well, it's good that you're here. Family is important on nights like these." I nodded and moved on, leaving him to his discomfort. Each interaction was the same. Initial pleasantness, followed by the awkward recognition of what was pinned to my coat, then the hurried attempts to change the subject or escape the conversation entirely. It was near the bar that I finally spotted my father. Richard Reeves looked exactly like what he was, a successful corporate executive enjoying his moment of celebration. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable, his face flushed with the warm glow of someone who felt appreciated and accomplished. He was surrounded by a small crowd of colleagues, all of them hanging on his words, as he told what was probably a well-rehearsed story about some triumph from his early days with the company. I watched him from across the room, studying his face, looking for any sign that this name tag situation was bothering him, that maybe he hadn't been the one to approve it. But he looked completely at ease, completely content with how the evening was unfolding. As if sensing my stare, he looked up and caught my eye. For a moment, our gazes held across the crowded room. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not with any particular affection, but with the polite acknowledgement you might give to any guest at your party. His eyes dropped to my name tag, and I saw something that might have been satisfaction flicker across his features before he turned back to his audience. That was when I knew. This wasn't Helen Carter's idea of a joke. This wasn't some administrative error or misplaced sense of humor from the event's planning committee. This was deliberate. This was my father's way of making sure everyone in the room knew exactly how he felt about me, exactly where I ranked in the family hierarchy. I excused myself to the restroom, not because I needed to use it, but because I needed 2 minutes away from the stares and whispers. The ladies' room was decorated in the same elegant style as the rest of the club. Marble countertops, gold fixtures, fresh flowers and crystal vases. I stared at myself in the mirror, at the name tag that seemed to glow like a neon sign against my navy coat. The mistake. 32 years old, and this was how my father chose to introduce me to his professional world. Not as his daughter who'd graduated summa cum laude from Portland State. Not as the woman who'd built her own successful consulting firm from nothing. Not even just as Sophia Reeves, but as the mistake.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I thought about all the ways I could respond. I could rip off the name tag and demand an explanation. I could cause a scene, make him as uncomfortable as he'd made me. I could leave quietly and never speak to him again. I could laugh it off and pretend it didn't matter. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do over 3 decades of being Richard Reeves' least favorite child. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked back out into that room with my head held high. The dinner portion of the evening began shortly after I returned. I found myself seated at the table with my family, though the conversation flowed around me rather than including me. Marcus talked about his latest promotion. Diana discussed her children's achievements in school. My mother shared updates about her charity work. I ate my salmon and listened, contributing only when directly asked a question, which wasn't often. Servers moved efficiently between the tables, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates. The room hummed with the satisfied chatter of people enjoying good food and pleasant company. If I'd been anyone else, if my name tag had read anything else, it might have been a lovely evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Brennan's voice carried across the room as he took the stage. If I could have your attention for just a moment. The conversations gradually died down as people turned toward the front of the room. My father stood from his seat at the head table, buttoning his suit jacket with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. We're here tonight to celebrate a remarkable career, Thomas continued. Richard Reeves joined Pacific Northwest Manufacturing Corp. 43 years ago as a junior accountant with big dreams and an even bigger work ethic. Tonight, he retires as our chief financial officer, having guided this company through recessions, expansions, acquisitions, and everything in between. The room erupted in applause. I clapped along with everyone else, watching my father accept the recognition he'd worked his entire adult life to earn. Whatever our personal relationship, I couldn't deny that he'd been dedicated to his career, that he'd earned the respect of his colleagues and the comfortable retirement that awaited him. Richard has been more than an employee, Thomas went on. He's been a mentor, a leader, and a friend. His integrity and wisdom have shaped not just our financial strategies, but our company culture itself. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing is what it is today, in large part because of Richard's contributions. More applause. My father nodded graciously, his face glowing with pride and satisfaction. This was his moment, the culmination of decades of early mornings and late nights, of missed family dinners and weekend work sessions. He'd sacrificed for this company, and now they were honoring those sacrifices. I know Richard is looking forward to spending more time with his family, Thomas said, gesturing toward our table. His wife Patricia, his son Marcus, his daughter Diana, and... His eyes found my name tag, and he paused for just a heartbeat before continuing. And his daughter Sophia. I noticed that he didn't read what was on my name tag. Even Thomas Brennan, CEO of a major corporation, apparently found the mistake too awkward to say out loud in front of 200 people. My father took the stage to a standing ovation. He looked out over the crowd with genuine emotion, his voice slightly rough when he began to speak. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for 43 incredible years. When I started at Pacific Northwest Manufacturing, I was young and eager, and probably made more mistakes than I care to remember." A few people chuckled knowingly. But this company, these people, gave me the chance to learn, to grow, to become not just a better employee but a better man. The relationships I've built here aren't just professional, they're personal. You've celebrated my victories and supported me through my challenges. You've been there for my family during difficult times. His eyes swept across the room, touching on faces throughout the crowd. When his gaze reached our table, it lingered on my mother, moved to Marcus, paused at Diana, and then skipped right over me as if I weren't there at all. "Patricia," he continued, "has been my partner through all of this. She's raised our children, maintained our home, and somehow put up with the long hours and business trips that this career demanded. Marcus and Diana have grown into successful adults who make me proud every single day." The crowd murmured appreciatively. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully neutral. He was thanking everyone who mattered to him, acknowledging everyone who'd played a role in his success. Everyone except me. "As I look forward to retirement," my father said, "I'm excited about the time I'll get to spend with the people who matter most to me. Golf games with old friends, vacations with Patricia, watching Marcus and Diana continue to build their own successful careers and families. This next chapter is going to be everything I've worked for." He raised his champagne glass, and the room followed suit. "Here's to Pacific Northwest Manufacturing, to all of you and to the future. Thank you for an incredible journey." The applause was thunderous. People stood, glasses raised, faces beaming with genuine affection for my father, and happiness for his well-deserved retirement. I stood with them, raised my glass with everyone else, and clapped for the man who had just, in front of 200 people, systematically acknowledged every member of his family except the one he'd labeled the mistake. As the evening wound down, people began to approach our table to offer their final congratulations and farewells. I watched my father accept handshakes and hugs, saw him beam as people praised his speech and wished him well in retirement. Several people mentioned how lucky he was to have such a wonderful family to enjoy his golden years with. Each time, his eyes would glance toward me and then away, as if confirming that the wonderful family they were referencing didn't include the daughter sitting at the far end of the table. It was nearly 10 o'clock when I finally decided I'd had enough. I stood quietly, gathering my purse and coat, hoping to slip away without creating any more awkwardness than my presence had already caused. But Diana noticed. "Leaving already?" she asked, loud enough to draw attention from the rest of the table. "It's getting late," I said simply. My father looked up from his conversation with a former colleague. "Sophia," he said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone at the table turn to look at us. "Before you go, I wanted to thank you for coming tonight." I waited, wondering if this was the moment he would acknowledge what had happened, maybe even apologize for the name tag situation. Maybe explain that it had been someone else's poor judgment, that he hadn't approved it, that he was sorry for how it had made me feel. Instead, he smiled that same polite smile he'd given me from across the room earlier. "I know these corporate events aren't really your thing, but it meant something to have the whole family here." The whole family. As if I'd been included rather than tolerated. As if my name tag hadn't marked me as unwanted. As if his speech hadn't erased me entirely. "Of course, Dad," I said quietly. "Congratulations on your retirement." I hugged my mother goodbye, a brief, perfunctory embrace that smelled like her familiar perfume and felt like a polite obligation. I nodded to Marcus and Diana, shook hands with their spouses, and made my way toward the exit. The October air hit my face like a blessing as I stepped outside the country club. The rain had stopped, leaving the world clean and shining under the streetlights. I stood under the covered entrance for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the cool air wash away the suffocating feeling of that elegant room and its elegant people and their elegant way of making me feel invisible. My rideshare arrived within minutes, And as we drove through the quiet Portland streets toward my apartment in the Pearl District, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the name tag, though that was humiliating enough. Not just being ignored in the speech, though that stung deeply. It was the casual cruelty of it all. The way everyone had participated in or ignored my public diminishment, as if it were perfectly natural. Back in my loft, I hung up my coat and immediately unpinned the name tag. I stood there holding it for a long moment, reading those words again. The mistake. My father's public verdict on my existence, printed in elegant script on quality cardstock. I walked to my home office and sat down at my desk, still holding the name tag. The view from my floor-to-ceiling window showed the city lights reflecting off the Willamette River, the bridges stretching across the water like jeweled necklaces. It was beautiful and peaceful, everything the evening should have been. I opened my laptop and began typing, my fingers moving with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. I had work to do, calls to make, decisions to implement. Because what my father and his colleagues and his wonderful family didn't know was that the mistake had been managing their financial future for the past 8 years. And tomorrow, Richard Reeves was going to learn exactly what happened when you underestimated the daughter you'd spent a lifetime dismissing. The rain resumed its gentle drumming against my windows as I settled into my leather desk chair, the city lights below creating patterns on the polished concrete floors of my loft. I placed the offensive name tag on my desk, positioning it where I could see those damning words clearly, the mistake. Let it serve as a reminder of what tonight had really been about. My fingers found the familiar grooves of my laptop keyboard as I opened a secure browser window. 3 passwords, 2 biometric scans, and 1 encrypted key later, I was staring at a screen that fewer than a dozen people in the Pacific Northwest had ever seen. The interface was clean, professional, unremarkable to anyone who might glimpse it over my shoulder. But the numbers flowing across the dashboard represented something far more significant than most people could comprehend. Clearwater Capital Management. My company. My creation. 8 years of careful planning, strategic networking, and financial acumen had built this firm into one of the most trusted pension fund administrators on the West Coast. We managed retirement portfolios for 17 major corporations, overseeing nearly $4 billion in assets. Conservative investments, steady growth, impeccable reputation. Exactly the kind of firm that risk-averse CFOs love to partner with. CFOs like Richard Reeves. I scrolled through the client dashboard until I found what I was looking for. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing Corp. Account established March 2019. Total assets under management, $847 million. Primary contact, Richard Reeves, Chief Financial Officer. Contract renewal date, November 30th of this year. Funny how life worked sometimes. When my father's company had been shopping for a new pension fund manager 5 years ago, they'd conducted an exhaustive search. They'd interviewed the biggest names in Portland, brought in presentations from Seattle firms, even considered a boutique operation out of San Francisco. They'd wanted someone with a proven track record, someone who understood the unique challenges of manufacturing industry retirements, someone who could deliver consistent returns without unnecessary risk. Clearwater Capital had checked every box. Our performance metrics were outstanding. Our client testimonials were glowing. Our fees were competitive. Most importantly, we had exactly the kind of steady, conservative approach that appealed to a CFO nearing his own retirement. Richard Reeves had personally recommended us to the board of directors. He'd praised our thoroughness, our transparency, our commitment to fiduciary responsibility. He'd never bothered to look closely at our ownership structure. Why would he? Clearwater Capital Management was incorporated in Delaware, with a registered office in Portland and satellite operations in Seattle and Vancouver. Our public filings listed David Chen as president and CEO, which was technically accurate. David was my business partner, a brilliant portfolio manager I'd met during my brief stint at a major investment firm 8 years ago. He was the public face of our company, the one who attended industry conferences and gave interviews to financial publications. What those public filings didn't show was that I owned 68% of Clearwater Capital. What they didn't reveal was that every major strategic decision, every client relationship, every investment philosophy came from me. David was the front man, but I was the brain behind the operation. I preferred it that way. It gave me the freedom to operate without the baggage of my family name, without the assumptions people made about Richard Reeves' daughter. I opened the Pacific Northwest Manufacturing file and began reviewing the details. Their pension fund had grown by 22% since we'd taken over management. Their retirees were receiving consistent payments. Their active employees were seeing steady growth in their retirement accounts. By every metric that mattered, Clearwater Capital had exceeded expectations. Richard Reeves had no idea that his company's pension fund was being managed by The Mistake. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "How was the family thing? You seemed stressed about it earlier." I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Enlightening. We need to talk tomorrow morning. Something's come up with the PNW manufacturing account." His response was immediate. "Everything okay? Their numbers have been solid. The numbers are fine. The relationship has become complicated." "Ah. Family drama?" "You could say that." I closed the text conversation and returned to my laptop. The pension fund dashboard showed me everything I needed to know about Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's retirement obligations. They had 847 active employees contributing to the plan, plus 312 retirees already drawing benefits. The fund was healthy, well-diversified, positioned for long-term stability. Exactly what you'd want to see as you headed into your own retirement. The contract renewal was straightforward enough. Standard terms, competitive fees, automatic rollover unless either party provided 60 days' notice. Richard Reeves had already signed the preliminary paperwork, confident that Clearwater Capital would continue managing his company's most important financial obligation for years to come. I scrolled through the investment portfolio, noting the careful balance of stocks, bonds, and alternative investments that had delivered such strong returns. Conservative but not stagnant. Diversified but not scattered. It was good work, the kind of portfolio management that had built Clearwater's reputation throughout the region. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I considered my options. The nuclear option would be to terminate the contract immediately, leaving Pacific Northwest Manufacturing scrambling to find a new pension fund manager just as their CFO was retiring. It would be legal, perfectly within our contractual rights, but it would also be devastating. Finding a new manager, transferring assets, rebuilding investment strategies, it could take months, during which time the fund would be essentially frozen. But that felt too crude, too obvious. Richard Reeves would never connect his daughter's humiliation to his company's financial problems. He'd blame the market, blame the economy, blame anything except his own actions. No, this needed to be more elegant, more personal. I opened a new document and began drafting an email to David. We needed to have a conversation about conflict of interest policies, about the ethics of managing funds for companies where we had personal relationships with key decision makers. It was a legitimate business concern, the kind of thing that any responsible firm would address proactively. The email took me 45 minutes to write, revise, and perfect. Professional tone, clear reasoning, impeccable logic. I scheduled it to send first thing Monday morning, then closed my laptop and finally allowed myself to feel the full impact of the evening. The retirement party felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been 3 hours since I'd walked out of the Riverside Country Club. 3 hours since I'd discovered how my father really saw me, how little I mattered to the family that had raised me. 3 hours since I'd realized that despite everything I'd accomplished, despite the successful business I'd built, despite the respect I'd earned in my professional life, I would always be the mistake to them. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Portland skyline. The rain had intensified again, turning the city lights into impressionist smears across the glass. It was beautiful and lonely, exactly how I felt. My phone rang, startling me from my contemplation. The caller ID showed my mother's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out. "Hello, Mom. Sophia, sweetheart." Patricia's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying to smooth over family tensions. "I wanted to call and thank you for coming tonight. It meant so much to your father to have everyone there." Everyone. As if I'd been part of the group rather than the outsider looking in. "Of course," I said neutrally. "I hope you weren't too bothered by that silly name tag business." Helen Carter has always had an odd sense of humor. Your father was actually quite upset about it when he noticed. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Dad was upset about it? Oh yes, he was mortified. He had no idea what Helen had done until someone pointed it out to him during dinner. He wanted to find you and apologize, but you'd already left by then. The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I'd seen my father's face when he looked at that name tag. I'd watched his expression when his eyes found it across the room. There had been no mortification, no upset, no plan to apologize. There had been satisfaction. That's good to know, I said quietly. He's planning to call you tomorrow to clear the air. You know how much family means to him, especially now that he's retiring. He's looking forward to spending more time with all of us. All of us. The phrase stung every time she used it, every time she pretended I was included in their vision of family harmony. I'm sure he is. Sophia, is everything all right? You sound distant. I took a sip of wine and considered my response. I could tell her how I really felt. I could explain that I'd seen through the lie, that I knew exactly who had approved that name tag and why. I could describe what it felt like to be erased from my father's speech, to be treated like an unwelcome guest at a family celebration. Instead, I said, I'm just tired, Mom. It's been a long day. Of course, sweetheart. Get some rest and remember, we're family. Whatever happens, that's what matters most. After she hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about families and loyalty and the stories we tell ourselves to make uncomfortable truths more palatable. My mother genuinely believed what she'd told me, or at least she'd convinced herself it was true. It was easier than acknowledging that her husband had deliberately humiliated their daughter in front of 200 people. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather in Portland. I'd slept fitfully, my dreams filled with name tags and retirement speeches, and rooms full of people who looked right through me. I woke feeling more resolved than angry, more determined than hurt. David Chen arrived at my office at 9 sharp, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place downstairs and wearing the slightly concerned expression he got when he sensed that something important was brewing. At 42, he was 5 years older than me, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that made clients trust him instantly. We'd been business partners for 8 years, friends for nearly as long, and he knew me well enough to recognize when I was operating on more than just professional considerations. All right, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. What's going on with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing? And don't tell me it's just about their numbers, because their portfolio is performing beautifully. I handed him a copy of the name tag I'd received the night before. He read it, frowned, read it again, then looked up at me with the kind of expression you might wear after watching someone kick a puppy. Your father's company, he said slowly. My father's retirement party, I confirmed. Jesus, Sophia, he approved this? He didn't just approve it. I'm pretty sure he suggested it. David set the name tag down carefully, as if it might contaminate his fingers. What do you want to do? This was why our partnership worked so well. No judgment, no lengthy discussions about whether my feelings were justified, no attempts to talk me out of whatever I was planning. Just a simple question about next steps. I want to review our conflict of interest policies, I said. Make sure we're not creating any ethical problems by managing funds for companies where we have personal relationships with key personnel. He nodded slowly. That's actually a legitimate concern. We've been fortunate so far that none of our client relationships have created personal complications, but it was bound to happen eventually. Exactly. And with Richard Reeves retiring, this seems like a natural transition point. The new CFO might want to bring in their own pension fund manager anyway. When's their contract up for renewal? End of November. But we could invoke the 60-day termination clause if we felt it was necessary to avoid any appearance of impropriety. David picked up the name tag again, studying it with the careful attention he usually reserved for investment prospectuses. This is about more than just professional ethics, isn't it? Of course it is, I said quietly, but that doesn't make the ethical concerns any less valid. We've built Clearwater on trust and transparency. We can't afford to have that reputation compromised by personal relationships gone bad. Their fund has over $800 million in assets. Losing that account would hurt us financially. We'll survive. We always do. He was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. How do you want to handle the transition? Professionally, respectfully. We'll give them the full 60 days, help them identify potential replacement managers, ensure a smooth transfer of assets. We'll do everything exactly by the book. And your father? What about him? Are you going to tell him why we're really terminating the contract? I considered the question. The honest answer was that I hadn't decided yet. Part of me wanted him to know, wanted him to understand, that actions had consequences. That treating his daughter like the mistake had cost his company their most successful pension fund manager. But another part of me recognized that the lesson would be more powerful if he never quite understood what had happened, if he spent his retirement wondering why his carefully planned financial future had suddenly become so complicated. I think, I said finally, that we should let our actions speak for themselves. David nodded and stood to leave. I'll draft the termination letter today. Standard language, professional tone, effective 60 days from delivery. Thank you. After he left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Portland skyline through the rain-streaked windows. In 60 days, Pacific Northwest Manufacturing would be scrambling to find a new pension fund manager. Richard Reeves would spend the first months of his retirement dealing with financial uncertainty instead of enjoying the peaceful transition he'd planned. His former colleagues would be asking questions, wondering how their rock-solid CFO had failed to maintain such an important business relationship. And through it all, he'd never quite understand that his comfortable retirement had been derailed by the mistake. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sophia, this is your father. Can we talk? There are some things I need to explain about last night. I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations were no longer worth having. The termination letter went out on Monday afternoon, delivered by certified mail to Richard Reeves personally. Standard business language, nothing emotional or personal, just a formal notification that Clearwater Capital Management would be ending our relationship with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing Corp. Effective December 31st. Professional courtesy, they called it. 60 days notice to find alternative arrangements. I imagined him opening that letter in his temporary retirement office, probably still glowing from the previous week's celebration, probably making plans for golf games and vacation trips. I wondered how long it would take him to understand what the letter really meant. How long before he realized that finding a replacement pension fund manager wouldn't be as simple as making a few phone calls. The pension fund management industry was smaller than most people realized, especially in the Pacific Northwest. There were only a handful of firms with the capacity and expertise to handle an account the size of Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's portfolio. Most of them were already at capacity, managing their own full client loads. The few that might be interested would need months to conduct due diligence, transfer assets, and implement new investment strategies. And all of this would be happening while Richard Reeves was supposedly enjoying his well-earned retirement. By Tuesday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Richard called 4 times, each message more urgent than the last. Patricia called twice, her voice tight with worry. Even Marcus left a voicemail, something about family emergencies and needing to stick together. I didn't return any of their calls. Wednesday brought a knock on my office door. My assistant, Jennifer, poked her head in with an apologetic expression. There's a Richard Reeves here to see you. He says he's your father and that it's urgent. I felt my stomach drop. Of course he'd come here. Of course he'd track down my office address and show up unannounced, expecting that family obligations would override professional boundaries. Tell him I'm in meetings all day, I said. He says he'll wait. Then tell him he'll be waiting a very long time. Jennifer nodded and closed the door. Through my office windows, I could see the reception area where my father was presumably sitting, probably checking his watch, and growing more impatient by the minute. Let him wait. Let him experience what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated as if his time and feelings didn't matter, He waited for 4 hours. Jennifer updated me periodically. He'd asked for water. He'd made several phone calls. He'd inquired again about my schedule. Finally, around 3 o'clock, she reported that he'd left, but not before asking her to give me a handwritten note. The note was brief, written on Pacific Northwest Manufacturing letterhead in my father's careful script. Sophia, I know you're angry, but this isn't just about our family anymore. 800 people are depending on that pension fund. Please call me. 800 people. He was right, of course. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing employed 847 people, and every one of them was counting on their retirement fund being managed responsibly. Their financial security shouldn't be collateral damage in a family conflict. But that wasn't really my problem, was it? I hadn't created this situation. I hadn't chosen to humiliate my daughter at a public event. I hadn't spent 32 years treating one of my children like an unwelcome burden. Richard Reeves had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. If those consequences affected other people, well, perhaps he should have considered that before he decided to label me the mistake. Thursday morning brought a call from Thomas Brennan, the CEO who'd given the speech at my father's retirement party. His voice was carefully controlled, professionally neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. Ms. Reeves, he said, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. Your father gave me your number. Of course not, Mr. Brennan. What can I do for you? I understand that your firm is terminating our pension fund management contract. I was hoping we might be able to discuss the situation, see if there's any way to resolve whatever concerns you might have. It was smoothly done, I had to admit. No accusations, no demands, just a reasonable request for dialogue. Exactly the kind of approach you'd expect from an experienced CEO facing an unexpected crisis. I appreciate you calling, I said, but the decision is final. We've identified some potential conflicts of interest that make it inappropriate for us to continue managing your fund. Conflicts of interest? Personal relationships with key personnel. It's a fairly standard ethical concern in our industry. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications. Would it help if Richard weren't involved in the oversight of the pension fund? He's retired now anyway, so there's no reason he needs to have any ongoing role. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Mr. Brennan. These kinds of conflicts can't be resolved by changing personnel assignments. The relationship itself is the problem. Another pause. Ms. Reeves, I'm going to be direct with you. We have 800 employees depending on this fund. Finding a replacement manager on short notice isn't going to be easy, and the transition period could create significant uncertainty for people who are counting on these benefits. I understand your concerns, I said, and that's exactly why we're giving you 60 days notice instead of invoking the immediate termination clause. That should provide adequate time to identify and onboard a replacement manager. In a perfect market, perhaps, but as I'm sure you know, there aren't many firms with the capacity to handle an account of this size. He was right, and we both knew it, but acknowledging that fact would undermine my position, would give him leverage to negotiate or delay the termination. I'm confident that a company with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's reputation will be able to find appropriate management for their pension fund, I said. If you'd like, I can provide you with a list of firms that might be interested in the account. That would be helpful, thank you. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. Thomas Brennan was a good man, a competent CEO who genuinely cared about his employees. He didn't deserve to have his company's financial stability threatened because of my family drama, but he also didn't deserve to benefit from a business relationship that had been built on my father's assumption that his daughter would never be in a position to affect his professional life. The irony was almost perfect. Richard Reeves had spent decades dismissing me as irrelevant, treating me like someone who would never amount to anything significant. And now, in the most important transition of his professional life, his comfortable retirement depended entirely on the goodwill of the mistake. I opened my laptop and began drafting a list of potential replacement pension fund managers. It was the least I could do for those 800 employees who had done nothing wrong except work for a company whose CFO had made some very poor personal choices. By Friday, the story had begun to spread through Portland's close-knit financial community. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing was looking for a new pension fund manager. Clearwater Capital had terminated the contract. Nobody seemed to know exactly why, which made the rumors even more interesting. I heard pieces of the speculation through industry contacts, through casual conversations at professional events, through the kind of gossip that always circulated when major business relationships ended unexpectedly. Some people assumed it was about fees or performance. Others suspected personality conflicts or strategic disagreements. A few wondered if Pacific Northwest Manufacturing was facing financial difficulties that hadn't been made public yet. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth was too absurd to be believable. Who would imagine that one of the region's most successful pension fund managers was the daughter of the CFO she'd just terminated? Who would think that a family conflict could have such significant professional ramifications? Richard called me 17 times that week. I didn't answer any of the calls, but I listened to every voicemail. The progression was fascinating from a psychological perspective. Confusion gave way to frustration, frustration to anger, anger to something that sounded almost like panic. Sophia, this is ridiculous. Whatever I did to upset you, we can work it out. Just call me back. I don't understand what's happening here. David Chen won't return my calls either. This is affecting innocent people. Your mother is worried sick. Marcus thinks you've had some kind of breakdown. Just talk to us. 800 families, Sophia. That's what you're playing with here. These people have worked their entire careers for these benefits. I know I wasn't a perfect father, but this is insane. You can't destroy people's retirement over some personal grudge. The last message was different, quieter, delivered in the kind of defeated tone I'd never heard from Richard Reeves before. I've been thinking about that name tag, about what happened at the party. I know you were hurt, and I know I should have handled things differently. But please, don't let 800 innocent people pay for my mistakes. They don't deserve this. For the first time since this all began, I felt something that might have been doubt creeping in around the edges of my resolve. He was right about those 800 employees. They didn't deserve to have their financial security threatened because of our family dysfunction. But they also didn't deserve to work for a company whose leadership thought it was acceptable to publicly humiliate employees' family members. Maybe there was a lesson in that too. I spent the weekend thinking about consequences and collateral damage, about justice and proportionality, about the difference between teaching someone a lesson and destroying innocent lives. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I called David into my office first thing and told him to draft a new letter to Pacific Northwest Manufacturing. We would honor our 60-day termination notice, but we would also provide them with a detailed transition plan, including temporary management services to ensure continuity during the handover process. We would recommend 3 specific firms that had the capacity to take on their account, and we would personally facilitate the introduction process. Most importantly, we would waive our standard termination fees and provide the transition services at cost, ensuring that Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's pension fund wouldn't suffer any financial penalties during the changeover. That's generous, David said. More than generous, actually. It's appropriate, I replied. This was never about the employees or the company. It was about one person who needed to learn that actions have consequences. And has he learned that lesson? I thought about Richard's voicemails, about the progression from anger to panic to something that might have been genuine remorse. I think he's starting to. The letter went out that afternoon, along with a comprehensive transition package that would make the changeover as smooth as possible for everyone involved. Professional, thorough, designed to minimize disruption while still making it clear that the relationship between Clearwater Capital and Pacific Northwest Manufacturing was ending permanently. My father called that evening, 30 minutes after the package would have been delivered to his temporary office. His voice was different this time, not angry or panicked, but thoughtful in a way I rarely heard from him. Sophia, he said to my voicemail, I got your letter and the transition documents. I want you to know that I appreciate what you're doing for the employees. They don't deserve to suffer because of our problems. He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath before continuing. I also want you to know that I understand now. What happened at the party, what I let happen, it was wrong. More than wrong, it was cruel. You deserved better from me, and I'm sorry. Another pause. I know an apology doesn't fix everything, and I know this business decision probably can't be undone. But I wanted you to hear me say it. I'm sorry and I was wrong, and you are not a mistake. You never were. I played the message 3 times before deleting it. The transition took exactly 60 days, just as planned. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing found a new pension fund manager, Cascade Investment Partners, a Seattle-based firm with an excellent reputation and the capacity to handle large institutional accounts. The handover went smoothly, with minimal disruption to employee benefits or fund performance. Richard Reeves spent his first 2 months of retirement dealing with financial uncertainty instead of playing golf. He learned firsthand what it felt like to have his future depend on other people's decisions, to worry about forces beyond his control, to discover that relationships he'd taken for granted were more fragile than he'd realized. It was a valuable education for a man who'd spent his career believing that some people mattered more than others, that some family members were worth acknowledging, while others could be safely ignored. And somewhere in Portland, the mistake was building an even more successful business, managing even more pension funds, protecting even more retirement dreams. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's success that speaks so loudly it drowns out every cruel word ever spoken about you. The first snow of the season dusted Portland's streets the morning Diana showed up at my office. December had arrived with an unexpected bite, coating the Pearl District in a thin layer of white that transformed the urban landscape into something softer, more forgiving. I was reviewing quarterly reports when Jennifer knocked on my door, her expression apologetic but firm. "Your sister is here," she said quietly. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent family business." Through the glass partition, I could see Diana pacing in the reception area, her designer heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. She wore a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her dark hair was pulled back in the kind of perfect chignon that required professional maintenance. Even in distress, she looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate fashion magazine. "Tell her I'm unavailable," I said, returning my attention to the reports. "She says she'll wait as long as it takes." I glanced up at Jennifer's face, noting the slight tension around her eyes. Diana had that effect on people, a commanding presence that made even strangers feel obligated to accommodate her wishes. It was a skill she'd perfected during her years climbing the corporate ladder, the ability to make her problems become everyone else's priorities. "Fine," I said, closing the report folder. "Send her in. But I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Diana swept into my office like she owned it, her movements quick and purposeful. She'd always been beautiful in that effortless way that came from good genetics and expensive maintenance. But today there were stress lines around her eyes and a tightness to her smile that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. "Sophia," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." "About what?" "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what this is about." She crossed her legs and leaned forward slightly, adopting the aggressive posture she probably used in board meetings. "What you're doing to Dad's company, to his retirement, it needs to stop." I kept my expression neutral, my voice level. "I'm not doing anything to Dad's company. Clearwater Capital made a business decision based on ethical considerations. It happens in our industry." "Ethical considerations?" Diana's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Come on, Sophia. We both know this is about that stupid name tag from the retirement party. You're destroying people's livelihoods over a joke." "A joke?" I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call it?" "What else would you call it? Dad didn't even know about it until someone pointed it out during dinner. Helen Carter thought she was being clever, and it backfired. It's not worth ruining 800 families over." The lie came so easily to her, delivered with such conviction that I almost admired the performance. Diana had always been skilled at rewriting history to suit her needs, at transforming uncomfortable truths into more palatable narratives, but I'd been there that night. I'd seen our father's face when his eyes found that name tag. I'd watched his satisfaction, his complete lack of surprise or concern. "Dad seemed pretty comfortable with it during his speech," I said quietly. "When he thanked Marcus and you by name, but somehow forgot I existed." Diana waved her hand dismissively. "He was nervous. You know how he gets during public speaking." "He probably just lost track of what he was saying." For 15 minutes? He lost track for an entire speech. Look, maybe he could have handled things better. Maybe we all could have. But this is insane, Sophia. You're punishing innocent people because your feelings got hurt. The casual dismissal stung more than I'd expected. Your feelings got hurt. As if decades of systematic exclusion, of being treated like an embarrassment, of being labeled the mistake in front of 200 people, could be reduced to something so trivial. Those innocent people work for a company whose leadership thinks it's acceptable to publicly humiliate employees' family members, I said. Maybe they deserve better management. You're not an employee, you're family. Am I? Because that name tag suggested otherwise. Diana's composure cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through her polished exterior. This is exactly why Dad never knew how to deal with you. Everything is always so dramatic, so personal. It was a stupid name tag, Sophia. A thoughtless mistake by someone who barely knows you. It's not worth destroying relationships over. You're right, I said, standing and walking to the window. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, coating the bare branches of the street trees in pristine white. It's not worth destroying relationships over, but the relationship was destroyed long before that name tag was printed. What are you talking about? I turned back to face her, studying her expression carefully. Diana genuinely seemed confused, as if the idea that our family relationships might be fundamentally broken was a foreign concept to her. But then again, why would she see the dysfunction? She'd always been the golden child, the one whose achievements were celebrated, whose opinions were valued, whose presence was welcomed. When was the last time Dad called me? I asked. Not to ask for something, not because Mom made him, but just because he wanted to talk to his daughter? Diana's mouth opened, then closed. She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. When was the last time any of you included me in family plans? Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, vacation trips? When was the last time I was invited instead of informed, consulted instead of ignored? You always seemed so busy with your own life, Diana said weakly. You never seemed interested in family gatherings. I stopped seeming interested because I stopped being welcome. There's a difference. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken resentments and willful blindness. Diana had always been comfortable with the family dynamics as long as they worked in her favor. She'd never questioned why Sophia was always the outsider, never wondered if there might be reasons beyond simple personality differences. So what? She said finally. You're going to punish all of us because you felt left out? You're going to destroy Dad's retirement because he wasn't the perfect father? I'm not destroying anything, I said, returning to my desk. I'm making a business decision that protects my company's reputation and eliminates potential conflicts of interest. If that creates problems for Dad's retirement, perhaps he should have considered that possibility before he decided to treat his daughter like an embarrassment. Diana leaned forward, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she'd always used when she wanted something. Sophia, listen to me. I know we haven't always been as close as we could have been. I know sometimes the family dynamics got complicated. But we're still sisters. We're still family. That has to count for something. Does it? Because I don't remember you defending me when Marcus made jokes about my career choices. I don't remember you objecting when Dad introduced everyone at dinner parties, except me. I don't remember you saying anything when that name tag was handed to me. I should have, Diana said quietly. You're right. I should have said something that night, and I didn't. I was uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. It was the first genuine thing she'd said since walking into my office, and it caught me off guard. For a moment I saw past the polished exterior to something more vulnerable, more human. But that doesn't mean you should destroy Dad's whole retirement over it, she continued. He's learned his lesson. We all have. Can't that be enough? Has he learned his lesson? Because according to Mom, he had no idea about the name tag. According to you, it was Helen Carter's idea, and Dad was mortified when he found out. Which story should I believe? Diana's face flushed slightly. Maybe we were trying to protect his feelings. Maybe we didn't want to admit how badly he'd handled things. Or maybe you were trying to protect your own feelings by pretending it wasn't as bad as it actually was. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What do you want from us, Sophia? What would it take to fix this?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities and limitations. What did I want? An apology that felt genuine rather than strategic? Acknowledgement of years of subtle cruelties and casual dismissals? A family that actually functioned like a family instead of a corporation with an unfortunate personnel problem? "I want you to stop pretending that this is about one name tag," I said finally. "I want you to acknowledge that this is about 32 years of being treated like I don't belong in my own family. I want you to admit that Dad knew exactly what that name tag said and approved it anyway, because he's never seen me as anything more than a disappointment." Diana winced as if I'd slapped her. "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time he expressed pride in my accomplishments? When was the last time he asked about my business, my goals, my life? When has he ever treated me like a daughter instead of a burden he's obligated to tolerate?" "He loves you," Diana said weakly. "No, he doesn't. He tolerates me because I'm family, and he's supposed to." There's a difference. The conference call I'd mentioned was fictional, but I used it anyway to end the conversation. Diana left with promises to talk to our parents, to help them understand my perspective, to work toward some kind of family reconciliation. But we both knew she was grasping at solutions to a problem that ran deeper than any single conversation could address. That evening, my phone rang constantly. Patricia called 3 times, her voice increasingly strained as she left messages about family unity and forgiveness. Marcus called once, his tone mixing frustration with something that might have been genuine concern. Even Diana called again, this time from her car, asking if I'd reconsider my position for the sake of family harmony. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my windows, watching the snow continue to fall across the city. "We were planning to renew your contract for another 5 years. He paused, studying my face carefully. "And then there's the nature of the termination itself. Professional but final. No negotiation, no opportunity to address concerns, no explanation beyond vague references to conflicts of interest." I kept my expression neutral, waiting to see where he was going with this. "It feels personal," he said finally, "which is unusual in institutional finance." "All business is personal to some degree," I replied. "People make decisions based on relationships, trust, comfort levels. Sometimes those factors change." "Is this about Richard Reeves?" The question was direct, delivered without preamble or diplomatic softening. Thomas Brennan hadn't built a successful company by avoiding difficult conversations. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "I've known your father for 15 years. He's a good CFO, meticulous with numbers, conservative with risk. But he's not always the most intuitive when it comes to people." I said nothing, but something in my expression must have encouraged him to continue. "The retirement party was unfortunate. I noticed the name tag situation, noticed how uncomfortable it made several people. I also noticed that you left early and that your father seemed oblivious to the impact of what had happened. That's between my father and me. Normally, yes. But when personal conflicts start affecting business relationships, they become my concern too." Thomas sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your father doesn't know you own Clearwater Capital, does he?" The statement hit like a physical blow. I felt my carefully maintained composure falter for just a moment, before reasserting itself. "I don't know what you mean. Ms. Reeves, I didn't become CEO by accepting surface explanations. When our pension fund manager suddenly terminates a profitable contract for vague ethical reasons, I investigate. When the termination happens 2 weeks after the retirement party for our CFO, I pay attention to patterns." My mouth felt dry. "What kind of investigation?" "Corporate filings, ownership structures, business registrations. David Chen is listed as your CEO, but the real control of Clearwater Capital rests with someone else. Someone who's been very careful to maintain anonymity, but not careful enough to hide from determined research." I stared at him across my desk. trying to gauge how much he actually knew versus how much he was guessing. Thomas Brennan was clearly more thorough than I'd given him credit for. Your father spent months researching pension fund managers 5 years ago, he continued. He interviewed dozens of firms, reviewed performance records, checked references. He was particularly impressed with Clearwater Capital's conservative approach and steady returns. He recommended you to our board personally. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. Richard Reeves had chosen his own daughter's firm to manage his company's most important financial obligation, never bothering to look beneath the surface to see who was actually making the decisions. He has no idea, Thomas said quietly. Does he? I was quiet for a long moment, weighing my options. Denying Thomas's conclusions would be pointless. He clearly had enough information to connect the dots, but confirming them would change the entire dynamic of the situation. No, I said finally. He doesn't know. Thomas nodded slowly. Which means he has no idea why his company's pension fund manager suddenly decided to terminate their contract. He's probably spending his retirement wondering what went wrong, how he failed to maintain such an important business relationship. That's not my problem, isn't it? You're his daughter. Am I? Because that name tag suggested otherwise. Thomas winced slightly. That was wrong. Inexcusably wrong. But destroying his retirement over it seems disproportionate. I'm not destroying anything. I'm making a business decision based on legitimate ethical concerns. Ethical concerns that didn't exist until you were publicly humiliated at his retirement party. The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. Thomas Brennan was clearly not interested in polite fiction or face-saving narratives. People's actions have consequences, I said quietly. Even parents' actions. Yes, they do, but so do children's actions. 800 families are going to experience uncertainty and stress because of this decision. Good people who work hard and deserve better than to be caught in the middle of a family conflict. It was the same argument Diana had made, the same point my father had raised in his voicemails. Everyone was concerned about the innocent employees, the collateral damage from my decision. But no one seemed to recognize that I'd been collateral damage for 32 years, that my feelings and dignity had been sacrificed repeatedly for the sake of family harmony. I've ensured that the transition will be as smooth as possible, I said. I've waived termination fees, provided extensive documentation, personally recommended replacement managers. Those employees will be fine. Will they? Or will they spend months worrying about their retirement security while their new fund manager gets up to speed? Thomas stood to leave, but paused at the door. Ms. Reeves, I'm not going to pretend I understand your family dynamics. But I will say this. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't more cruelty. Sometimes it's grace. After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring out at the snow-covered city. Grace. It was an interesting concept, the idea that strength could be demonstrated through mercy rather than punishment. But grace required forgiveness, and forgiveness required some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. As far as I could tell, my family was still operating under the assumption that this was all a massive overreaction to a harmless joke. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. This time it was Marcus, looking uncharacteristically disheveled in a wrinkled suit and day-old stubble. My successful, confident brother appeared to have had a rough few days. Sophia, he said, slumping into the chair across from my desk without his usual swagger. We need to fix this. Fix what? Don't be obtuse, you know what. He ran his hands through his hair, messing it up even further. Mom's having panic attacks. Dad's locked himself in his study, making phone calls to lawyers and financial advisors. Diana's convinced you've had some kind of breakdown. And what do you think? Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying my face with an intensity I rarely saw from him. At 34, he'd always been the golden child, the one whose path through life had been smooth and supported. Success had come easily to him, partly because he was genuinely talented, but mostly because he'd always had the full support of our family behind him. I think, he said slowly, that you're angrier than any of us realized. It was a more perceptive observation than I'd expected from him. I think, he continued, That we've all been pretty blind to how you felt about your place in the family. And how did I feel about my place in the family? Like you didn't have one. The simple honesty of it caught me off guard. Marcus had always been casual about family dynamics, treating our relationships like background noise that didn't require much attention. But apparently he'd been paying more attention than I'd given him credit for. That name tag was fucked up, he said bluntly. I laughed because I was uncomfortable and didn't know how else to react. But it was wrong, and Dad was wrong to let it happen. Dad didn't let it happen. Dad made it happen. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. Diana keeps insisting it was Helen Carter's idea, but that doesn't make sense. Helen's worked for the company for 30 years. She wouldn't make that kind of decision without approval. So why did he do it? Why does he treat me like an embarrassment? I don't know. Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. You're successful, you're smart, you've built something impressive with your business. I never understood why he couldn't see that. Maybe, because seeing it would require admitting he was wrong about me. Maybe. Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. But whatever his reasons, this is destroying him. And it's destroying Mom, too. She keeps talking about how she failed as a mother, how she should have protected you better. She should have. You're right, we all should have. But that doesn't mean you should destroy Dad's retirement over it. I was getting tired of everyone framing this as destruction, as if holding people accountable for their actions was somehow cruel and unusual punishment. I'm not destroying anything, I said for what felt like the 100th time. I'm ending a business relationship that has become ethically complicated. By ethically complicated, you mean personally uncomfortable. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked, what would it take to fix this? What would Dad need to do to make things right? It was the same question Diana had asked, the same question I'd been asking myself. What did I want? What would constitute adequate acknowledgement, appropriate apology, sufficient change? I want him to admit what he did, I said finally. I want him to acknowledge that the name tag wasn't Helen Carter's idea, that it wasn't a harmless joke, that it was a deliberate choice to humiliate me in front of his colleagues and friends. I want him to explain why he's spent 32 years treating me like a disappointment instead of a daughter. And if he does that, if he admits he was wrong and apologizes, then maybe we can have a conversation about the future. Marcus nodded and stood to leave. I'll talk to him. See if I can make him understand what this is really about. Good luck with that. After Marcus left, I found myself thinking about family dynamics and childhood roles, about the ways people get locked into patterns that persist long after the original reasons have been forgotten. I'd been the mistake for so long that it had become my identity within the family structure. Changing that would require everyone to acknowledge that the structure itself was flawed, that they'd all participated in something cruel and unnecessary. That evening, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Sophia? The voice was unfamiliar. Female. Nervous. This is Helen Carter, from your father's company. I felt my stomach tighten. Helen Carter, the woman who'd handed me that name tag with such casual indifference. What can I do for you, Mrs. Carter? I wanted to apologize, she said quickly, about that name tag at the retirement party. I know it upset you, and I wanted you to know that it wasn't intended to be hurtful. Here it was, the lie that everyone seemed determined to perpetuate. Helen Carter calling to take responsibility for something she'd never done, probably at the request of my father or someone else in the family. Who asked you to call me? I asked. There was a pause. Nobody asked me to call, I just felt bad about what happened. Mrs. Carter, let me ask you a direct question. Did you create that name tag yourself, or did someone tell you what to put on it? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't understand what you mean. It's a simple question. Did you decide to label me the mistake? Or did someone suggest that wording to you? The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Your father said it would be funny. He said you'd get the joke. And there it was. The truth. finally extracted from someone who'd been asked to carry the blame for Richard Reeves's cruelty. "Thank you for your honesty," I said quietly. "Please don't tell him I told you that. I need this job." "I won't tell him." "But Mrs. Carter?" "Yes? Don't ever let anyone ask you to humiliate someone again, even if they tell you it's just a joke." After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that yet. But clarity. The truth had a weight to it that all the lies and excuses couldn't match. My father had deliberately, intentionally chosen to humiliate his daughter at his retirement party. He'd asked someone else to do his dirty work, then let them take the blame when it backfired. That was who Richard Reeves really was. Not the respected CFO, not the devoted family man, not the pillar of the community. He was someone who would sacrifice his own daughter's dignity for a moment of cruel amusement, then hide behind others when called to account for it. The snow had stopped falling outside my windows, but the city remained blanketed in white, beautiful and clean, covering all the sharp edges and ugly corners that normally defined the urban landscape. But like Helen Carter's phone call, the snow was temporary. Eventually, the truth would emerge from beneath whatever pretty lies people used to cover it. Tomorrow would bring more phone calls, more visitors, more pleas for family unity and forgiveness. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace with my decision. Some relationships couldn't be saved because they'd never really existed in the first place. Some families were just groups of people who happened to share DNA, held together by obligation rather than affection. And some mistakes weren't the people who'd been labeled that way. They were the choices made by the people doing the labeling. I closed my laptop, finished my wine, and went to bed with the sound of the city settling into winter quiet outside my windows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities. The business world was full of people who valued competence over bloodlines, who measured worth by achievement rather than convenience. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn a place in a family that had never really wanted me. Maybe it was time to focus on the family I'd chosen instead. My business partners, my clients, my friends. The people who saw me as Sophia Reeves, the successful entrepreneur. Not the mistake, who'd had the audacity to be born into the wrong family. The snow would melt, spring would come, and life would go on. With or without the people who'd never really been there for me in the first place. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light from my office windows. Patricia Reeves requests the pleasure of your company for a family gathering to discuss recent developments and chart a path forward. Sunday, December 15th, 2 o'clock, at the family home in West Hills. RSVP requested. I stared at the formal language, so typical of my mother's approach to difficult situations. Turn it into an event, wrap it in social niceties, pretend that decades of dysfunction could be resolved with proper etiquette and afternoon tea. The invitation felt heavy in my hands, weighted with expectation and desperation. David Chen knocked on my office door, interrupting my contemplation. "The Peterson account files are ready for your review," he said, then noticed the cardstock in my hands. More family drama? A summit meeting, apparently. My mother's attempt at diplomatic resolution. "Are you going?" I set the invitation down on my desk, aligning it precisely with the edge of my leather desk pad. "I haven't decided yet." "For what it's worth," David said, settling into the chair across from me. "You've made your point. Everyone knows you're not someone to be dismissed or ignored. Sometimes knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to start." It was sage advice from someone who'd watched me navigate this situation with increasing intensity over the past month. David had seen the toll it was taking, the way the family conflict was bleeding into my professional focus and personal peace. But he also understood that some battles couldn't be abandoned halfway through. "They still don't get it," I said. "They think this is about hurt feelings and wounded pride. They think an apology and some family bonding will fix everything." Maybe it would. Maybe that's enough. I looked at him carefully. David was one of the few people who knew the full story, who understood both the business implications and the personal cost of what had happened. If he thought I should consider reconciliation, his opinion carried weight. You think I should go? I think you should decide what you actually want out of this situation. Revenge? Justice? Acknowledgement? Relationship repair? Once you know what you're hoping to achieve, the decision becomes clearer. After he left, I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about goals and outcomes, about the difference between winning and succeeding. What did I want from this family summit? What would constitute a satisfactory resolution to decades of casual cruelty and systematic dismissal? The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure anymore. The anger that had driven my initial response was still there, but it had been joined by something more complex, a kind of weary resignation that came from finally seeing my family clearly. You couldn't force people to love you the way you needed to be loved. You couldn't demand respect from people who had fundamental problems with your existence. But you could demand accountability. You could insist on truth instead of comfortable lies. You could refuse to pretend that cruelty was kindness, that exclusion was protection, that systematic diminishment was somehow in your best interest. I RSVP'd that evening with a simple text to my mother. I'll be there. Sunday arrived cold and clear, with the kind of sharp winter light that made everything look precisely defined. I drove through the West Hills neighborhood where I'd grown up, past the large houses with their manicured lawns and circular driveways, past the tennis courts and private parks that had defined my childhood geography. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating than it had seemed when I was young. The Reeves family home sat on 2 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, a colonial revival with white columns and black shutters that had been featured in Portland Home and Garden twice during my childhood. My mother had been proud of those magazine features, proof that she'd successfully created the kind of elegant domestic environment that reflected well on the family's status and taste. I parked in the circular driveway behind Marcus's BMW and Diana's Mercedes, noting that I was apparently the last to arrive. Strategic timing on their part, ensuring that I'd walk into a room where everyone else was already positioned and prepared. But I'd expected that. Patricia Reeves didn't leave important conversations to chance. The front door opened before I could ring the bell. My mother stood there in a cream silk blouse and charcoal slacks, every silver hair perfectly arranged, her makeup flawless despite the stress of the past month. She looked like she was hosting a garden party rather than a family intervention. "Sophia," she said, leaning forward to kiss my cheek, "thank you for coming. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us." I followed her through the familiar hallways, past the formal living room with its antique furniture and fresh flower arrangements, past the dining room where we'd had so many awkward family meals over the years. We ended up in the family room, a more casual space with comfortable sofas and a fireplace that actually got used. The others were already there, arranged around the room like actors taking their positions before the curtain rose. Marcus sat in the leather armchair that had always been his preferred spot, while Diana occupied one end of the sofa, her husband Kevin beside her looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. My father stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring at the flames as if they held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. "Richard," my mother said gently, "Sophia's here." He turned slowly, and I was struck by how much he'd aged in the past month. The confident, successful executive from the retirement party had been replaced by someone who looked smaller, older, worn down by stress and uncertainty. His eyes met mine briefly, then darted away. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I took the remaining seat, a chair positioned slightly apart from the family grouping. Even now, even at their request, I was still somehow separate from the core unit. "I asked everyone here," my mother began, "because we need to address what's been happening. This situation with the pension fund, the business relationship, the family tensions, it's affecting all of us, and it needs to be resolved. Some situations can't be resolved," I said. "Some damage is permanent." "Nothing is permanent if people are willing to work at it," Patricia replied, her voice carrying the firm optimism she'd always used to smooth over family conflicts. "We're family, Sophia. That means something." "Does it? Because I'm not seeing much evidence of that." Diana shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "Look, we all know that things got out of hand at the retirement party. The name tag situation was inappropriate and hurtful. But destroying Dad's retirement over it seems extreme. I'm not destroying anything. I'm running a business according to ethical principles. Oh, come on, Marcus said, his frustration finally breaking through his careful composure. You can't seriously claim this is about ethics. This is about revenge, pure and simple. The accusation hung in the air, harsh and uncompromising. But at least it was honest. More honest than the careful diplomatic language everyone had been using for weeks. Maybe it is about revenge, I said quietly. Maybe people who spend decades treating their daughter like an embarrassment should face some consequences for that choice. Decades? My mother's voice rose slightly. Sophia, that's not fair. We've always supported you, always encouraged your independence. Encouraged my independence? I felt something snap inside me, years of accumulated resentment finally finding its voice. You encouraged my absence. There's a difference. I stood and walked to the built-in bookshelf that covered one wall of the room, running my fingers along the spines of books that had been carefully selected for their appearance rather than their content. Do you want to know what I remember about growing up in this house? I remember being told I was too sensitive when Marcus made fun of my clothes. I remember being uninvited to family events because my presence might make things awkward for other guests. I remember sitting at the dinner table while you discussed Diana's achievements and Marcus's successes, while my accomplishments were either ignored or dismissed as unrealistic dreams. That's not how I remember it, my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him directly. Really? Then how do you remember it, Dad? How do you remember the time I won the state science fair and you missed the ceremony because you had a golf game? How do you remember telling me I should consider community college instead of a 4-year university because I wasn't quote-quote university material? How do you remember introducing me to your colleagues as our youngest instead of using my name? His face had gone pale, but he didn't respond. How do you remember that name tag, Dad? The one that labeled me the mistake at your retirement party. Do you remember approving that? Or are we still pretending it was Helen Carter's idea? The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. I could see the shock on my mother's face, the discomfort on Diana's, the dawning understanding on Marcus's. But it was my father's expression that mattered most. The guilty recognition of someone who'd been caught in a lie he'd been telling himself for so long he'd almost believed it. Helen Carter called me, I continued, my voice steady and clear. She wanted to apologize for the name tag. She also wanted to explain that it wasn't her idea, that you specifically asked her to put those words on it, that you told her I'd get the joke. My father's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. What kind of father, I asked, thinks it's funny to publicly label his daughter as a mistake? What kind of man humiliates his own child in front of 200 people and then hides behind someone else when called to account for it? I didn't think, he started, then stopped. You didn't think what? That I'd find out? That I'd care? That I'd be hurt by being called a mistake at your retirement celebration? I didn't think it would matter that much, he said, his voice breaking. You've always been so strong, so independent. I thought you could handle it. The honesty of it was more devastating than any lie could have been. He'd deliberately chosen to humiliate me because he believed I was strong enough to absorb the cruelty without causing problems for him. My resilience had become permission for his casual brutality. So because I was strong enough to survive your treatment, that made it acceptable? No, he said quietly. It didn't make it acceptable. Nothing makes it acceptable. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind a tissue. Diana stared at her hands, while Marcus looked between me and our father with an expression of dawning horror. I need you to understand something, I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on my father. This isn't just about one name tag, one retirement party, one moment of cruelty. This is about 32 years of being treated like I don't belong in my own family. This is about being systematically excluded, dismissed, and diminished by the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. I walked back to my chair but didn't sit down. You want to know why I'm ending the business relationship with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing? It's because I finally realized that I don't owe my loyalty to people who have never shown me any in return. You want to know why I won't just forgive and forget? It's because forgiveness requires acknowledgement, and until today, none of you were willing to acknowledge what actually happened. We're acknowledging it now, Diana said desperately. We're admitting that things went wrong, that mistakes were made. Isn't that enough? Mistakes were made, I repeated. That's not acknowledgement, Diana. That's passive voice deflection. Mistakes don't make themselves. People make choices, and those choices have consequences. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the coffee table in the center of the room. Since we're finally having an honest conversation, let me share some information that might interest you. My father looked at the folder with growing alarm. Sophia, what is that? Documentation, I said simply. Legal records, business filings, financial statements. Everything that proves what you've suspected but been afraid to confirm. I opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. Corporate registration papers for Clearwater Capital Management. Ownership disclosure forms. Financial statements showing the company's growth and profitability over the past 8 years. I own 68% of Clearwater Capital, I said, watching their faces as the implications sank in. The pension fund management company that you personally recommended to Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's board of directors. The firm that has been managing your retirement security for the past 5 years. My father sank into the nearest chair, his face gray with shock and something that might have been fear. You've been working for me, Dad. Indirectly, but still. Your company has been paying management fees to a firm owned by the mistake. Your comfortable retirement has been secured by the daughter you've spent decades dismissing as incompetent and unrealistic. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that I felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching them process the full scope of it. Every quarterly report you reviewed, every performance analysis you praised, every recommendation you made to the board about our excellent service, it all came from me. The daughter you didn't think was quote-quote university material has been managing nearly $1 billion in retirement assets, including your own. Marcus was the first to find his voice. Jesus Christ, Sophia, you built all this? I built all this. While you were climbing the corporate ladder with Dad's connections, and Diana was leveraging family relationships for her career advancement, I was creating something real, something valuable, something that didn't depend on anyone's approval or support. I pulled out another document, placing it carefully on top of the others. This is the termination notice for Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's account. It becomes effective February 15th, which gives the company adequate time to find replacement management. The transition will be handled professionally, with full documentation and asset transfer protocols. But why? My mother asked, her voice small and broken. If you've been managing the account successfully, if everything was working well, why end it now? Because I can't continue to work for people who fundamentally don't respect me, I said. Because every time your husband praised Clearwater Capital's performance, he was unknowingly praising the competence of the daughter he'd labeled incompetent. Because the cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. I sat back down, feeling strangely calm now that all the cards were on the table. You want to know what's really tragic about this situation? If Dad had simply treated me with basic human dignity, if he'd shown me the same respect he'd show any professional colleague, none of this would have happened. The business relationship would have continued indefinitely. His retirement would have remained secure. The family dynamics could have stayed exactly as they were. They can still stay that way, Diana said desperately. You could reverse the termination, continue managing the account. Nothing has to change. Everything is already changed, I replied. The moment that name tag was handed to me, everything changed. You can't unknow what you know now. You can't unfeel what you felt. You can't undo 32 years of accumulated damage with one conversation. My father finally looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since I'd arrived. What do you want from us, Sophia? What would it take to fix this? It was the same question everyone had been asking, and I finally had an answer. I want you to understand that I don't need to be fixed, I said. I want you to recognize that the problem was never with me. it was with how I was treated. I want you to acknowledge that your choices had consequences, that your actions hurt people, that your assumption that I was strong enough to handle mistreatment didn't make the mistreatment acceptable. I stood again, gathering the documents from the coffee table and returning them to the folder. Most importantly, I want you to understand that forgiveness isn't something you can demand or negotiate. It's something that might happen over time if people demonstrate genuine change rather than just expressing regret at getting caught. And the business relationship? My father asked quietly. The business relationship is over. That decision is final and non-negotiable. But that doesn't mean our family relationship has to be over too. It just means it needs to be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than convenience. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. I'm not doing this to hurt you, any of you. I'm doing this because I finally realized that I deserve better than the way I've been treated. Everyone deserves better than that. The drive back to my apartment took me through the same familiar neighborhoods, but somehow the landscape looked different now. Not smaller or less intimidating, but clearer. The elegant houses, with their perfect lawns and circular driveways, were just buildings, after all. The people inside them were just people, with their own fears and flaws and failures. Back in my loft, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my windows, looking out at the Portland skyline. The city lights reflected off the Willamette River, creating patterns that shifted and changed with the water's movement. Beautiful and temporary, like so many things in life. My phone buzzed with a text from David. How did the family summit go? I typed back, honestly, for the first time in 32 years. Good or bad? Both. Mostly necessary. I set the phone aside and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened that afternoon. The truth was finally out there, all of it. The years of casual cruelty, the systematic exclusion, the deliberate humiliation, the business relationship that had existed without my family's knowledge. No more lies, no more polite fiction, no more comfortable narratives that protected everyone except the person who'd been hurt. It would take time to know whether honesty would lead to healing or simply to a cleaner kind of separation. But either way, the pretending was over. The careful dance of family dysfunction had finally been interrupted by someone willing to say what everyone had known, but been afraid to acknowledge. Outside my windows, the city settled into its evening rhythm. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again, following their predictable patterns. People went about their lives, most of them blissfully unaware that someone's long-hidden truth had finally found its voice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose honesty over comfort. But tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt genuinely free. Free from the weight of unspoken resentments. Free from the obligation to pretend that cruelty was kindness. Free from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who had never really been willing to give it. The truth had been expensive, costing me a business relationship worth millions, and potentially costing me a family relationship that had never been as valuable as I'd wanted it to be. But it had also been liberating, clearing away years of accumulated confusion and self-doubt. Whatever came next, at least it would be built on a foundation of reality rather than wishful thinking. And sometimes, that was the best anyone could hope for. The snow outside had melted, leaving the streets wet and gleaming under the streetlights. Spring would come eventually, bringing new growth and new possibilities. But first, winter had to finish its work of stripping away everything that couldn't survive the cold, leaving only what was strong enough to endure. I raised my wine glass to the window, toasting the city and the night, and the strange, painful, necessary process of telling the truth after decades of polite silence. Some stories could only end one way, with honesty that hurt everyone involved, but hurt less than the lies that had preceded it. This was my story, finally told in my own voice, finally free from the constraints of other people's comfort and convenience. It wasn't the story I'd wanted to tell when I was young, but it was the story I'd needed to tell to become the person I was meant to be. The phone rang again, but I didn't answer. Whatever came next could wait until tomorrow. Tonight belonged to me, to the truth, and to the quiet satisfaction that came from finally refusing to be anyone other than exactly who I was. Spring arrived early in Portland that year, with cherry blossoms blooming in February and daffodils pushing through the last patches of snow. I walked through Tom McCall Waterfront Park on a surprisingly warm Saturday morning, watching joggers and dog walkers enjoy the unexpected gift of premature sunshine. The Willamette River moved slowly beside the path, carrying pieces of winter debris toward the distant mountains. It had been 3 months since the family summit, 3 months since I'd laid all the cards on the table and watched decades of carefully constructed fiction collapse under the weight of truth. 3 months of silence from West Hills, punctuated only by a few tentative text messages from Marcus, and one awkward coffee meeting with Diana that had resolved exactly nothing. The pension fund transition had gone smoothly, just as I'd promised. Cascade Investment Partners had taken over Pacific Northwest Manufacturing's account in mid-February, and the employee's retirement security had never been threatened. Thomas Brennan had sent me a handwritten note expressing his gratitude for our professionalism during the changeover, along with a standing offer to provide references for Clearwater Capital's future business development. My father's comfortable retirement had become considerably less comfortable, though not because of financial hardship. The transition to new pension management had created weeks of uncertainty and paperwork, forcing him to spend the first months of his leisure time dealing with bureaucratic complications instead of enjoying the golf games and travel plans he'd envisioned. More importantly, he'd been forced to explain to his former colleagues why his company's relationship with such a successful fund manager had ended so abruptly. I'd heard through Portland's interconnected professional networks that Richard Reeves had become something of a cautionary tale in CFO circles, the executive who'd somehow lost a top-performing pension manager during his own retirement transition. The whispered speculation about what had gone wrong had apparently been more damaging to his reputation than any direct accusation could have been. But none of that was why I was walking through the park on this particular morning. I was here because I'd received a letter, handwritten on simple stationery, delivered to my office rather than my home address. The return address bore my father's name, but the careful script was unfamiliar, shakier than I remembered, as if age or stress had affected his motor control. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, and I'd read it perhaps a dozen times since then, searching for hidden meanings or strategic manipulations. But each reading convinced me more that it was exactly what it appeared to be, an honest accounting from someone who'd finally run out of comfortable lies to tell himself. I found an empty bench facing the river and pulled the letter from my jacket pocket, unfolding it carefully. The paper was cream-colored, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind my father had always used for important correspondence. Dear Sophia, it began. I've started this letter 15 times over the past month, trying to find words that might adequately express what I need to say to you. Each attempt has felt insufficient, manipulative, or self-serving. Finally, I've decided that simple honesty might be the only approach that matters anymore. The next paragraph had been the most difficult to read the first time, and it remained painful now. You were right about everything. The name tag was my idea, suggested to Helen Carter, because I thought it would be amusing to publicly acknowledge what I'd privately believed for too many years. You were right that I'd spent decades treating you as an embarrassment, a disappointment, someone who didn't quite fit the vision I had for my family. You were right that I'd systematically excluded you from recognition, celebration, and basic respect. He'd gone on to detail specific memories that matched my own, missed school events, dismissed achievements, casual cruelties that had seemed insignificant to him, but had accumulated into a lifetime of feeling unwanted. I told myself that you were strong enough to handle my indifference, that your independence was proof that my attention wasn't necessary. I convinced myself that pushing you away was somehow helping you develop resilience and self-reliance. These were lies I told myself to justify behavior that had no justification. The most devastating paragraph came near the end. Learning about Clearwater Capital, about the success you'd built while I was dismissing your potential, has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. You achieved everything I always claimed to value: financial independence, professional respect, genuine accomplishment, and you did it without any support from the family that should have been celebrating your success. You became exactly the kind of person I raised Marcus and Diana to become, except you did it despite my influence rather than because of it. The letter concluded with something I'd never expected to read from Richard Reeves. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I don't expect our relationship to be repaired, because I'm not sure it can be. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I did, why it was wrong, and how much it must have cost you to endure it for so many years. You deserved better from me. You deserved better from all of us. I'm sorry it took a crisis to make me see that clearly." A jogger passed by, her footsteps rhythmic on the paved path. Somewhere behind me, children were playing on the playground equipment, their laughter carrying across the park like music. Normal Saturday morning sounds, the kind of background noise that usually felt comforting and peaceful. Today it felt surreal, as if I were experiencing someone else's life. For 32 years, I'd waited for some acknowledgement from my father that I mattered, that I was valued, that I deserved the same respect and attention he gave to my siblings. Now, when I'd finally stopped waiting, when I'd built a life that didn't depend on his approval, the acknowledgement had arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Coffee later? I have news about the Martinez Group contract." I typed back, "Sure. Usual place at 2? Perfect. Everything okay? You seemed distracted yesterday." I looked down at the letter in my hands, then back at the river flowing steadily toward the horizon. "Just processing some family stuff. I'll tell you about it later." The truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt about my father's letter. Part of me felt vindicated. Finally, someone in my family had looked honestly at our history and acknowledged the pattern of harm that had shaped my entire childhood and young adulthood. But vindication felt strangely hollow when it came 32 years too late to change anything fundamental. Another part of me felt angry that it had taken a business crisis and public embarrassment to force this honesty. Would Richard Reeves have ever examined his treatment of me if I hadn't been in a position to affect his comfortable retirement? Would he have bothered with self-reflection if the consequences of his cruelty hadn't finally caught up with him? But there was also something else, something I hadn't expected to feel, a kind of peace that came from finally being seen clearly by someone who had spent decades looking right through me. Whatever his motivations, whatever had prompted this sudden burst of honesty, my father had finally acknowledged my reality. The gaslighting was over. The pretense that I'd been treated fairly was abandoned. The careful fiction that family dysfunction was my fault, rather than my wound, had been exposed. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket, then pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I wanted. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment before I pressed it. "Marcus?" I said when he answered. "It's Sophia. Are you free for lunch today?" There was a pause, probably surprised that I was initiating contact. "Yeah, sure. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I just think it's time we had a real conversation." We met at a small restaurant in the Pearl District, the kind of casual place where business professionals grabbed quick lunches between meetings. Marcus arrived first, looking older than I remembered but more relaxed than he'd appeared during our family confrontation. Success in his tech career had given him a confident ease that hadn't been there when we were younger. "Thanks for calling," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you ever would." I wasn't sure I would either. We ordered our food and made small talk about work and weather until the server left us alone. Then Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the defensive bullshit I gave you at Mom's house. I participated in your exclusion for years, either actively or by staying silent when I should have spoken up. I benefited from Dad's favoritism without ever questioning why you weren't receiving the same treatment. It was more direct than I'd expected, more honest than our family typically managed." "Why now?" I asked. "Because I've been thinking about it for 3 months. Because I realized that if someone had treated my daughter the way Dad treated you, I'd be furious. Because I finally understood that you didn't choose to be the family outsider. We made you the family outsider." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I also realized that you've been more successful than any of us. And you did it without the advantages Diana and I took for granted. Dad's connections, family financial support, the assumption that we belonged wherever we showed up. You built something real on your own, and instead of celebrating that, we treated it like it didn't matter. It felt like it didn't matter to you. It should have mattered. It should have been the thing Dad bragged about at dinner parties. His daughter, the successful entrepreneur, the one who built a multi-million-dollar company from scratch. Instead, he acted like your accomplishments were somehow less legitimate than ours. The food arrived, giving us both a moment to process the weight of what we were discussing. I picked at my salad, thinking about family dynamics and the stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "Anything." "Did you know? When we were growing up, did you recognize that I was being treated differently, or did it seem normal to you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I knew you were different. Quieter, more serious, less interested in the family social scene. I told myself that was just your personality, that you preferred to be on the periphery. But looking back, I think I knew it wasn't entirely voluntary. I just didn't want to examine it too closely because that would have made me complicit. And now? Now I realize I was complicit whether I examined it or not. Staying silent when someone is being mistreated is its own form of participation." After lunch, we walked through the neighborhood, past the art galleries and boutiques that had transformed this part of the city over the past decade. The conversation had shifted to lighter topics. His work, my business expansion plans, shared memories that weren't loaded with family dysfunction. "Diana wants to reach out to you," Marcus said as we approached my office building. "She's been drafting emails for weeks but can't figure out what to say." "What does she want to say?" "Probably the same thing I wanted to say. That she's sorry, that she understands now, that she wishes things had been different." I nodded, considering this. "Tell her she can call me if she wants. I'm not ready for a big emotional reconciliation, but I'm willing to have honest conversations." "And Dad?" I thought about the letter in my pocket, about the careful honesty of his words and the years of damage that had preceded them. "Dad and I have some things to work through. It's going to take time." "But it's possible. Working through it?" "I think so. Maybe. Ask me again in 6 months." That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and a legal pad, writing a response to my father's letter. It took me 4 drafts to find the right tone. Honest without being cruel. Clear without being dismissive. "Dear Dad," I began. "Thank you for your letter. It means more than you probably realize to finally have my experience acknowledged rather than explained away or minimized. I wrote about the cost of growing up feeling unwanted in my own family, about the professional success that had felt hollow, because the people who should have been proudest of me seemed indifferent to it. I wrote about the business relationship that had existed without his knowledge, about the strange satisfaction and sadness that had come from secretly managing his financial security while he publicly dismissed my competence. "I'm not ready to forgive yet," I wrote near the end, "but I'm willing to begin the much harder work of rebuilding a relationship based on truth rather than convenience. That will require sustained effort and genuine change, not just expressions of regret. But for the first time in my adult life, I believe it might be possible." I sealed the letter in an envelope and set it aside to mail the next morning. Outside my windows, the city sparkled with lights reflecting off the river, beautiful and complex, and constantly changing. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Ms. Reeves? This is Angela Ross from Cascade Investment Partners. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to reach out because we've been so impressed with the transition documentation your firm provided for the Pacific Northwest manufacturing account. The level of detail and organization made our job significantly easier." "I'm glad to hear that." "I'm calling because we're expanding our operations and looking for strategic partnerships with other fund management companies. Based on your work with PNW Manufacturing, I think there might be some interesting opportunities for collaboration." After we finished discussing the potential partnership, I sat back in my chair and smiled. It was funny how things worked sometimes. Ending one relationship had opened the door to new ones. Cutting ties with a painful family dynamic had led to unexpected professional opportunities. The next 6 months passed quietly but productively. Clearwater Capital signed 2 new major clients, including a partnership arrangement with Cascade Investment Partners that tripled our assets under management. David and I hired 3 new portfolio managers and opened a satellite office in Seattle. Marcus and I developed something that actually resembled a sibling relationship, built on mutual respect rather than childhood roles. Diana and I exchanged occasional emails and had coffee twice, awkward but genuine attempts to connect as adults rather than as the people we'd been forced to be as children. My mother called every few weeks, usually with updates about family news or invitations to birthday dinners and holiday gatherings. I accepted some invitations and declined others, making decisions based on my own comfort level rather than family expectations. My father and I exchanged several more letters over the summer, each one a small step toward understanding rather than reconciliation. He was seeing a therapist, he told me, trying to understand the patterns that had shaped his parenting choices. He'd also made donations to several organizations that supported young women in STEM fields, a gesture that felt more meaningful than any apology. The letter that surprised me most arrived in September, written in my mother's familiar script. "Sophia," it began, "I need to acknowledge my own role in what happened to our family. I told myself I was protecting you by not intervening, that drawing attention to your father's treatment would only make things worse. I convinced myself that staying neutral was the kindest approach. I was wrong." She wrote about the social pressures that had shaped her own life, about the generation of women who'd been taught that family harmony was their responsibility regardless of the cost to individual family members. It wasn't an excuse, she emphasized, but it was an explanation for choices she now recognized as cowardly. "I should have protected you," she concluded. "I should have demanded better treatment for my daughter. I failed you and I'm sorry." By October, I felt like I was living in a different world than the one I'd inhabited a year earlier. The anger that had driven so many of my decisions had been replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of acceptance that people were imperfect, and that families were collections of imperfect people trying to figure out how to love each other without causing too much damage. The anniversary of my father's retirement party passed without acknowledgement from anyone. But I marked it privately by treating myself to dinner at the restaurant where I'd had my first business meeting with David 8 years earlier. It felt appropriate somehow, celebrating the professional relationship that had sustained me when family relationships had failed. As winter returned to Portland, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. Clearwater Capital was thriving, my personal relationships were healthier, and I'd finally stopped waiting for other people's approval to feel successful. The last letter I received from my father came in early December, exactly 1 year after the family summit. "Sophia," it read, "I wanted you to know that your mother and I have decided to revise our estate planning. Previously, the bulk of our assets were designated to pass to Marcus and Diana, with a smaller inheritance for you. We're changing that to equal distribution among all 3 children, which is what we should have done originally." He explained that they'd also established an educational fund in my name, designed to provide scholarships for young women pursuing business degrees. The fund would be administered through the Community Foundation, ensuring that it would continue long after they were gone. "This isn't an attempt to buy forgiveness or erase the past," he wrote. "It's simply an acknowledgement that you've always deserved the same consideration as your siblings, and that our estate should reflect the family we're trying to become rather than the family we've been." I read the letter twice, then set it aside and returned to the business plan I'd been developing for Clearwater Capital's next phase of expansion. Equal inheritance was nice, but it wasn't why I'd fought for recognition. I'd fought because everyone deserves to be seen clearly by the people who claim to love them, because truth is more valuable than comfort, because children shouldn't have to earn their parents' basic respect. The snow began falling again outside my windows, coating the city in fresh white that would be beautiful until it melted and revealed the world beneath. But for now, for this moment, everything looked clean and new and full of possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "The Morrison Group wants to schedule a presentation next week. This could be the big one." I typed back, "Excellent. Let's show them what Clearwater Capital can do." Because that's what mattered now. Not the family that had failed to see me clearly for 32 years, but the future I was building for myself and the people who chose to be part of it. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying the people who'd hurt you. It was becoming so successful, so fulfilled, so genuinely happy that their opinion of you became irrelevant. Outside, the snow continued to fall, beautiful and temporary, covering everything in pristine possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances. to choose grace over grievance and growth over stagnation. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by exactly the kind of respect I'd always deserved. It had taken 32 years, a public humiliation, and the courage to burn down a relationship that had never really existed, but I'd finally found my way home to myself. And that, I realized, had been the point all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.